Teachers want to stay safe, and they want to keep the kids safe. And the heads of their unions have been fighting the good fight all summer to ensure their perspectives get heard. Tonight, we'll hear from 3 of Ontario's largest teacher unions on what they've been fighting for and what they're still pushing to see as the school system opens to more students every day. Then, how can the stock market be doing so well, even though the economy definitely is not? We'll explore that. It's Tuesday, September 15th, and that's ahead on the agenda. It's been something of a slugfest between the provincial government and the unions that represent Ontario's teachers. They disagree over class sizes, ventilation, and whether the reopening plan violates the province's own health and safety rules. In fact, the dispute is headed to the Ontario Labour Relations Board. Last week, we heard from the Minister of Education. Tonight, it's the union's turn. Sam Hammond is in downtown Toronto. He represents more than 80,000 elementary school teachers and education workers. Harvey Bischoff is in North York, and he represents more than 60,000 secondary school teachers and education workers. And Liz Stewart is in Midtown Toronto and represents more than 45,000 Catholic school teachers. And she is in Midtown, as we suggested. And I think this is the first time the 3 of you have been together for one television interview in one setting. So we're glad you are doing it on TVO tonight. Let's just get the immediate feedback from what you're hearing. Sam Hammond, start us off. You've been in touch with your teacher members. What are they telling you about the state of play today?
Well, Steve, our members since day one have let us know how concerned they are, how anxious they are about the lack of a real reopening plan that focuses truly at all levels on the health and safety of our members and students. But even with that anxiety and concern, they have, as I know the other affiliate members have, gone into classrooms to do what they do best, and they are trying to make the best of a really bad situation.
Harvey, what are you hearing from your people?
Well, very similar. An absolute commitment to provide whatever kind of support and confidence they can to the students in their classes while feeling a great deal of anxiety on their own. A lot of that anxiety arises out of the fact that plans have been so unclear. There's been just an abdication of leadership from the Ministry of Education. Boards are scrambling. As late as Sunday, teachers in Windsor, members of mine, didn't know what they were supposed to be teaching a 4-hour class of on Monday. So that kind of uncertainty just increases the anxiety and the difficulty in doing their best on behalf of their students.
And Liz Stewart, how about you?
Well, I mean, very similar to my colleagues, right? We have members all across the province who, their students are just returning to school. They're not even sure who's on their class list, what it is they're going to be teaching. So all of those anxieties, and also the general anxiety about how do we keep everybody safe. But I also know that they're very excited, right? The start of a school year always brings that excitement about meeting your new students and getting to know them as people as you move through the year. But this year, it's definitely heavily overlaid with real anxieties.
Well, Sam, there's no question this is a year unlike any other, a beginning of school year unlike any other. But I think the most up-to-date numbers we've seen is that about 3/4 of the children in this province are going back to school. Do you have to infer from that apparently a lot of people have at least a modicum of confidence in what the provincial government is doing?
Steve, I would suggest I haven't done a scientific survey, research-based survey, but I would suggest to you from what I have heard from parents across this province on social media, directly and in emails, is that many of them don't have a choice in terms of having their children return to school. There are so many equity issues in terms of, I just saw recently a single mom with 2 students in the public system who has no choice. She needs to go to work and she needs to send those kids back to school. So I wouldn't suggest that the fact that 70 to 75% of parents who are sending their kids back to school are doing it because they're confident in the system. I think far from it.
Okay, Harvey, not confident. Let's grant that. Let's say no parent's going to put their own child willingly in danger, even if they have to make a living. So can we conclude that there's at least some confidence in the ministry, in the government, in the school boards, in your teachers, to do a good job and figure this all out?
There's effort on the part of my members and their representatives to do a good job and figure this out. I haven't seen the same kind of commitment from the ministry that has repeatedly refused to have any meaningful consultation with us. I think there's a slightly different calculation between the risk for any individual student, that's the calculation that parents are making, and the risk to the system as the whole. And so what is the likelihood that things are going to go wrong somewhere in the system? And that's what we should be trying to avoid, as opposed to, undertaking that individual student kind of calculation.
Well, let me pick up on that with Liz. Liz, every school in the province apparently has a plan in place whereby if a student or teacher or caretaker or whoever contracts COVID-19, everybody knows what to do. There's a plan in place and it becomes in effect. Are you comfortable and or confident that that's going to happen?
Well, I mean, it depends on how well that plan is communicated. Do people actually know what the steps are? Who has ultimate responsibility? Is it the public health? Is it the school boards? Because, I mean, frankly, the haphazard approach up to this point has been quite stunning as we've been trying to put plans in place. And the other piece is what we have been pushing for is, isn't it better to have prevention measures in place? Isn't it better to try and make sure we don't have to worry about possible outbreaks in schools? And that's where we have been wanting to talk about for months.
Sam, what about the fact, the Minister of Education was on this program last week saying we have more public health nurses being able to fan out to more schools than ever before. We've put more money in than ever before in order to take care of deep cleaning and physical distancing and additional money for additional teachers, not as many as you want, admittedly, but more. He thinks he's got his bases covered at this stage of the game anyway. What do you say?
Well, first of all, he hasn't put more money in than ever before because this is the first time we've had to deal with this kind of a situation in Ontario. And, this goes back in terms of the money, the investment, Steve, to your previous question about confidence in the system. I would suggest to you that if the minister had actually done what he said he was going to do, he and the premier in June, that they were going to cap class sizes at 15 and make sure that happened, in addition to ensuring that buses weren't running at capacity, I'll bet you right now we would have seen probably 99 to 100% of parents back in classrooms. So I think the biggest investment where the minister has fallen short is with regards to cohorts and smaller class sizes and not leaving that up to school boards.
I appreciate your position on that, and let me follow up with Harvey on that. I guess the fact of the matter is, if you wanted to cap class sizes at 15, you would essentially have to find almost twice as much space as is currently constituted in the education system in order to educate the children in that way. That sounds like a logistical impossibility. How could they even have done that had they wanted to?
Had they begun, working on this plan by the end of March, when we began pleading with them to work with us on the reopening, not knowing at that time when it would come, but knowing it would be an enormously complicated project, maybe one of the most complicated a provincial government in Ontario has ever undertaken to reopen schools in a pandemic. We would not have achieved perfection, but we could have come a lot closer to meeting what has been defined over and over again by public health experts as the #1 priority for making the return to school safe, which is reducing the number of students in class and allowing for the same physical distancing that's required in every other public space in the province. And why that doesn't apply to schools is a mystery to me. So they could have gotten a lot closer. And instead, we are seeing classes of 30, 33 high school students in non-designated boards, 30 junior and senior kindergartens together in a single class, which is, mind-boggling, frankly. And, I'd echo the words of a Globe and Mail editorial just yesterday that said that it beggars the imagination that we are returning to classes of that size.
Liz, what are you hearing from your Catholic teachers about how well they are able to, for example, put the desks at least 1, but maybe even 2 meters apart in order to accommodate physical distancing protocols?
Well, I mean, it's next to impossible, right? I mean, getting the 1 meter has been a great struggle, and in many places they're just not able to do it. I mean, if you think about your average classroom, you'd have to strip every other piece of furniture out of the classrooms, and some of it is fixed to the walls, so it's impossible to do. So I think what we've been hearing is, that's certainly a concern, the distancing. It's access to running water and the ability for hand washing. It's access to PPE, which, we still hear is not in place everywhere across the province. It's making sure there's hand sanitizer available within classrooms. It's actually hand sanitizer that children can use, because that would be a #1 priority, you would think. And it's making sure that there's proper ventilation. I mean, in many of our schools, the windows don't open. And even if they do open, they don't open enough to really generate that airflow that's required. And certainly the school ventilation systems are not built for this. So there's a whole myriad of issues. And distancing is one important piece of it. And it's, one that is just not possible.
Sam, let me do one more go round on class sizes with you. And this is going to sound like a smart aleck question, but it's really not meant to be. I know you want smaller class sizes for the very legitimate reasons that you've put on the record here right now. But of course, I've talked to government sources as well who say, of course the teacher unions want smaller class sizes because that means we'll have to hire a lot more teachers. They'll get more union dues. And then when the next election comes around, there will be that many more people who are going to try to unelect us than would have been the case before. I see you shaking your head already, but speak to that argument if you would.
Well, here's my response, Steve. Shame on this government for suggesting that's what we at ETFO or anyone else is doing, parents and every other stakeholder in this province. This has nothing to do with our call for smaller class sizes related to pedagogy, etc. This is simply our call for smaller class sizes is simply related to the health and safety of students and our members in this system now. And we know full well that those teachers that are hired on to reduce those class sizes, once this is over, we'll go through our staffing processes and we'll be once again, probably in a year or so, arguing to make classes smaller for very different reasons.
Harvey, I take your point on this, and I am not for a second disputing the genuineness with which the three of you are making this argument. But I wonder if you are the right messengers for this argument, given that you do open yourselves up to the possibility that you're really just trying to increase membership in addition to the other things that you've mentioned. What about that?
I've seen the Premier do this before the pandemic struck during bargaining. He's doing it again now. He wants to turn this into a battle between his government and unions because he thinks that's good ground for him. And it's a distraction from the real issues. But let's be clear, if the unions were the only ones saying we need smaller class sizes, he may have a point. Fact is, parent groups, medical experts, the Ontario Principals Council, multiple groups are opposing this inadequate return to school plan. And if we're not the best messengers to some people, fine. Listen to the parents groups who are grassroots society members who are saying over and over and over again, this is not sufficient.
Liz, one more thing on this, and that is, I do remember some weeks back the Ontario Liberals coming out with, I think what they said was a $3 billion plus costed plan, which would have involved a lot of the things that all three of you have mentioned here tonight on TVO. Part of that plan, I gather, would have involved the hiring of, say, 17,000 to 20,000 new teachers in order to achieve some of these goals that you've pointed out. Even if you had the money for that and wanted to do that, are there 20,000 teachers out there available to come teach right now?
Well, I think there's been a myriad of solutions. The Toronto District School Board put forward a solution as well that wouldn't have involved that kind of hiring and wouldn't have involved that kind of price tag. So I think from what we've been saying is we need to reduce class size. There's many different ways that we can do that. We've been more than willing to be flexible, come to the table, have those conversations, but the ministry just hasn't wanted to listen. And look, it's not just us saying that distancing is necessary and so therefore we need to reduce class sizes. We also have to think about what's the rationale for having schools open. A big push has been that it's also for the mental health and well-being of students, that we make sure that they're able to be in classrooms. But in order for that to be maintained, we need to make sure it's a successful and sustainable reopening. And on a purely economic level, we need it to be a sustainable reopening, and therefore an investment needs to be made.
With just a few minutes left here, let me do one more go around with the three of you here. And obviously the Ministry of Education is the one you deal with most of the time. But the fact is, you all have dealings with the Ministry of Labor as well, because if you believe the classrooms are unsafe, you have to deal with the Ministry of Labor in order for your teachers to say, that's an unsafe classroom, and I just don't feel comfortable going to work there that day. Sam, start us off on that. How often are you hearing from your teachers, I don't think it's safe, I'm afraid to catch COVID, I can't show up for work today?
Well, in terms of them feeling anxious and concerned that it's not safe based on a number of different issues, just about every day. But the next step to that is that they, as employees with school boards, taking the next step to say that they think it is an unsafe work condition and starting that process through the administrator and through the Ministry of Labor. It is very concerning, because I think the first thing is that, the Minister of Education has not mandated actual 1 meter or 2 meter distancing in schools, hasn't mandated a number of students that should be on school buses, hasn't actually mandated a cap on class sizes per se. So we're leaving it, Steve, to our individual members to make those determinations based on the information that we've provided them.
Harvey, how are the secondary teachers handling this?
Yeah, so through our local leaders, we provided training to members about their rights under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. A worker in Ontario has the right to refuse unsafe work. For teachers, that's a limited right. Their first obligation is to their students, and they have to secure the health and safety of their students first. But then they can exercise the steps where they have objective reason to believe they may be unsafe. For example, there hasn't been PPE provided.
Liz, any Catholic school teachers, to your knowledge, declining to show up for work so far?
We did, I know, have a couple of work refusals last week. Our members are well aware of their rights under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and I do know that some felt they needed to exercise those rights. That the situation, to the best of my knowledge, has been resolved. And that's what will happen on a case-by-case worker. Situation, for example, a worker will, may refuse unsafe work, and then hopefully the situation is able to be resolved to everyone's satisfaction at that site level. But I think, further is that the government did not, the ministry did not give firm standards to school boards about what had to be in place. And because they didn't issue those orders, we have a myriad of different ways across the province that are being rolled out. And that is why, we as affiliates find ourselves, before the Labour Board again, with a complaint filed because of that lack of health and safety standard.
Well, I know these are incredibly long and busy days for you three, and I'm really grateful that we were able to get all three of you on TVO tonight to take our questions. Sam Hammond, Harvey Bischoff, Liv Stewart, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks.
As each day passes, more and more Ontario students are back to hitting the books in person or online. With us now for a wide-angled look at this reopening phase, here's Caroline Alfonso, the education reporter for the Globe and Mail, and she joins us off the Danforth in the provincial capital. And Caroline, it's good to see you again. You just watched those interviews by the teacher union heads. What stood out for you?
I think one of the things that stood out, one we've been hearing about quite a bit over the last little while, is the issue of class sizes and how is that playing out in schools across the province. What we're seeing with class sizes is that a lot of parents more recently in some of the larger urban boards have been opting out of that in-class learning as a result of that and going into virtual schools. And that was sort of, discussed a bit by the three union leaders just before this segment.
Yeah, do you, based on your reporting, know of any major boards or major schools in this province where they are actually figuring that out tickety-boo? They've got the desks 2 meters apart. The ventilation is good. It's all going exactly the way it should be.
I don't think anybody is, it's smooth sailing for anybody right now. It's a different year. It's a year like no other. We're seeing some increases in infection rates outside in the community in some areas of the province. Kids are returning to school right now a bit anxious. Parents especially are a bit anxious. Maybe the kids not so much. Some of them are really looking forward to seeing their friends. But parents are a bit anxious. And I think things are sort of just playing out. Everybody's seeing how the return to school goes, making changes as kids return to the classroom.
I guess I should take advantage of your expertise and your being here to get you to fact check that last discussion as well. Is there anything that any of the three said that you thought, wait a second, that's just not accurate?
I don't know if what they said was inaccurate. I mean, there was one point where you mentioned the fact that they're looking to increase their membership, and that's why they want smaller class sizes. I don't know how, from what I'm hearing, how accurate that is. A lot of teachers who would be assigned to classrooms right now to lower class sizes would be long-term occasional teachers. They would be on contracts at the moment. So they wouldn't be full-time members right away to lower class sizes, for example.
Gotcha. Just for the record, I was repeating what a government source had said. Why would we want to hire all these people who will then go work against us during the next election campaign? Right.
Of course.
Having said that, what is being undertaken right now is unprecedented in our lifetimes. We are trying to send, as many as 2 million, it won't be that many obviously, but as many as 2 million children back into the classroom under much less than ideal circumstances. Is there an understanding out there that the government needs to be cut a certain amount of slack because we are in unprecedented times?
Oh boy, Steve, I guess, you're correct about the unprecedented times and the fact that maybe perhaps no government has got this return to school quite just right yet. But from what I'm hearing is that there was not enough perhaps planning going on in the early days of the summer. We only got the back to school plan in late July, early August. And even then, there were a couple of boards, Toronto in particular, Ottawa, that had to revise their plans at the very last minute and get things rolling. And to this day, with virtual learning being delayed at a couple of boards, they're still revising plans. So should they have received slack? I'm hearing that perhaps they needed to do some advanced planning, some creative planning that needed to take place in the month of June and perhaps even earlier.
And why didn't that happen?
The government in June laid out 3 scenarios for back to school. There was the online, the hybrid model, and the full-time learning. And they kind of left it that way. And school boards, individual school boards, were planning for all 3 models and were supposed to present those models to the provincial government. From what I understand, school boards were working quite hard over the summer months to come up with those scenarios, to present them. And then they did, and some of them were rejected in the end. So there was I feel like there needed to be more creativity on how to build outdoor spaces for kids to learn. What other spaces could be used for kids to learn in order to lower those class sizes, which parents are really demanding.
You say some of those plans were rejected. Rejected by whom?
By the Ministry of Education. The Toronto board in particular had a plan in place where kids could end the school day earlier, so that teachers' preparation time would be used at the end of the school day. And that would keep a teacher with a cohort for the entire day. And it would lower class sizes. And the province said, no, we want kids learning for 300 minutes a day. And 300 minutes, that's a week. Sorry, that's what we wanted. They also made some proposals around high school high school learning and how the cohorts would work. And that plan was also it did not receive the rubber stamp for the province, so they had to go back to the drawing board and redo those plans.
And is that the Ministry of Education that deserves, calling out on this, or is that because we're in a bureaucratic moment here, where the minister or the Ministry of Education can say, yeah, but I didn't get the sign off from the medical officer of health or from the local public health officer, or Where does the buck stop, I guess, ultimately on this decision?
It is with the government. It is with the Ministry of Education. The government is the one that laid out the plans for back to school and how they were supposed to work. School boards took those plans and tried to implement them the way they should be implemented or the way they thought they were supposed to be implemented. And then they submitted those plans and there were changes made. Changes made perhaps at the last minute. And so maybe the plans were not articulated properly to the school boards. Maybe there was some confusion there. And really that time was wasted. That time of confusion was wasted when back to school plans could have been rolled out much more smoothly than they are right now.
Caroline, we know already certainly the high school for the Toronto District School Board has been delayed. The opening has been delayed twice. Of course, usually it's a day after Labor Day. Then they said Tuesday of this week, which would be today. Now they've said Thursday for this week. Are you, based on your reporting, are you satisfied that even with the delayed opening, the schools are as prepared as they can be to handle what they've got to handle?
I think so. The delay is for high school students. I know my little one, my eldest started school today in elementary school. My youngest starts tomorrow, and they have delayed virtual learning, and they delayed that twice because of the number of students in Toronto that have opted, or the number of families in Toronto that have opted to go online as well. Have the plans, are they ready? Is that the question, Steve? I mean, time will tell. Kids are in school right now in Toronto, in the Catholic board and the public board. We'll see how the week goes.
I do wonder how much we tend, obviously, in the provincial capital to think that most of what happens here speaks for the whole province. And of course, it's not the case at all. We know that, as close as 2 hours drive north of here, there's essentially no COVID at all in much of, rural and northern Ontario. Very small outbreaks in much of the province, but in a lot of the provinces, nothing going on at all. To the best of your knowledge, where there is no COVID, are things fairly normal in the way that they are getting back to school?
I think we have to remember that we may not experience the same things in northern remote bodes as we do here, but one of the things that they're seeing is the issue of school buses and school bus drivers that we need to keep in mind, right? There's no limits on the number of kids on a school bus, and sometimes those kids are riding buses for 2 hours a day to get to their school. There's no limits. There's a shortage of bus drivers. So how do you get those kids to school? How do you get them there on time when parents are working? So there's other complications in different boards that are still being ironed out.
And I did hear Andrea Horvath, the opposition leader in the legislature yesterday during question period, point that very thing out, that a lot of bus drivers are nervous about showing up to work because they got 50 or 55 kids in a bus. And you can be sure they're not 2 meters apart. That's for darn sure. Tell me this, Caroline, any thought being given? Let's say you're in high school. You finished off grade 11, and you certainly, you didn't have a typical year. Now you're starting grade 12, your final year allegedly before post-secondary, and it's not going to be a normal year again. Is there any thought to bringing back grade 13, given how unusual the last 2 years have been?
I haven't heard anything around that, Steve. I know there's a number of students in grade 12 that do before this pandemic even, who do a fifth year in high school. So that is not uncommon, a gap year or a fifth year. I haven't heard any thought to bringing in grade 13 or that OAC year. I think they're hoping that sort of the cohort model in high school in designated boards, designated boards being the large urban boards, will sort of work out where kids are doing a combination of online learning and in-class learning. And, in non-designated boards, the kids are in school full time.
Caroline, we got a minute left. I don't normally ask personal questions, but you did refer to it just a moment ago. You're not just the education reporter, you're a parent. You sent your 9-year-old back to school today. How'd that go?
I did. He was really excited only because he knew his best friend was going to be in the class with him, and his lovely, lovely teacher called over the weekend to answer any questions and to talk to him and to make sure that he knew that his best friend was sitting beside him. I, on the other hand, was full of jitters, Steve, and I think I still am until I pick him up at the end of the day just to see how it went. But going to the school and dropping him off, It was pretty smooth. The teachers were there. We did not get into the school grounds, but there was, we had to go through that health checklist and drop him off, and he was pretty happy to be there. I'm still unsettled, but we'll see how the day goes.
Well, you're going to have to do it all again tomorrow with your younger one, aren't you?
I am. My 5-year-old starts grade 1 tomorrow morning, and she is over the moon excited that she's going to have her own desk.
Mom does not look as over the moon excited about all of this, but hang in there, shall we say that?
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that.
Not at all. That's Caroline Alfonso, whose visits to this program we always enjoy. She's the education reporter for the Globe and Mail, and a bit of a nervous parent, we can say as well. Thanks a lot, Caroline.
Thanks, Steve.
It's been a great year for the stock market, but it's been a terrible year for the economy. How does that make sense? Well, let's find out from Frances Donald. She is Managing Director, Global Chief Economist, and Global Head of Macroeconomic Strategy for Manulife Investment Management. And Brian Milner, freelance business and economics writer, both of whom join us from the provincial capital tonight, and it's good to see you two again. I want to, start by saying we want to consider, obviously, the differences between the stock market and the economy, and let's, for the purposes of this discussion, Frances, to you first, say that when we talk about the markets, we're talking about the Dow Jones, we're talking about the S&P and the TSX. Here in the provincial capital. So with that in mind, what's the significance in particular of those three markets apropos our discussion tonight?
Well, generally, most of the time when you turn on your TV and hear about the markets, people are usually referring to the S&P 500, which is by far the largest index. It is US-based. It's 500 very large US companies, what their stock performance did that day. Now, if you're talking about Canadian markets, you're usually referring to the TSX. That's 60 Canadian companies, what they did on that day. And then the Dow Jones, historically referenced more often, but a little bit less lately. That's 30 big companies. And of course, every one of those markets is going to behave somewhat differently. They have different companies inside of them, and they, of course, have different sectoral weight. Which sectors we're talking about will vary quite a bit among all of those three markets.
And Brian, following up on that, if you check those 60 companies that are on, for example, the TSX, that is supposed to give you a broad, general consensus understanding of what the economy is doing in this country? Is that the idea?
Well, in theory, but the fact is that the Canadian market, and the TSX, of course, is the Canadian market, is really mostly resource stocks and financial stocks. So if you assume that Canada is strictly governed by those two sectors, then yeah, it reflects the economy. But of course, Canada is much broader than that and much bigger than that. And these sectors might be doing very well when the rest of the economy isn't. It's not really correlated that strongly. It certainly hasn't been for a long time.
Well, Frances, is the stock market supposed to be an indication of the health of the economy in general?
Well, no, and sometimes it gets played that way because the better the economy is doing, the better companies will do. I have two roles. I'm both an economist and a strategist, and the reason I'm employed by people who manage money is to give you a GDP forecast. How will the economy do? Why? Because over the long run, that's our best guess of how companies' earnings will do over that period. So there is a relationship between them. But what we have to remember is that really the companies within our markets are not the same division as they are over our economy as a whole. So typically, you're not going to find people saying, well, the economy is doing well, I'm going to invest in the TSX. You're going to hear people more saying, I like Canada's energy sector, therefore I will buy energy stocks. Now, that's not to say that there's nowhere to invest in Canada if you want to make a play on the economy. Usually our Canadian bond market and the Canadian dollar have a much closer relationship than the stock market. There is a link, but it's really not as simple as saying the stock market is the economy. That's just not factually what's happening here.
No, for sure. And Brian, maybe you could follow up in this regard. One could understand the public being confused about that because on the one hand, they see the markets doing reasonably well. And on the other hand, we just experienced the biggest shrinking of the Canadian economy on record since StatsCan started keeping records almost 60 years ago. Why is there such a large disconnect at this particular juncture?
Well, because the drivers in the market, especially in the U.S. market right now, are the big tech giants, and there are 5 or 6 of them, and they're dominating market conditions, and people are betting heavily on them, I would say too heavily, on the fact that they're innovative, they've done very well even during the pandemic, and that their prospects in the future still look terrific because they basically have monopoly power in their sector. That is not the economy. If you look, in fact, even at the S&P 500, which is supposed to be a fairly broad index, the 5 biggest companies in that index are Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet. Those are the, and Facebook, those are the giant companies. Those 5 companies account for about 1/5 of the entire S&P earnings. So it's not balanced, and that doesn't tell you very much about how the economy as a whole is doing. How we know that retail is struggling, energy stocks are in trouble. We know that the bulk of the economy is not doing nearly as well as these 5 tech giants.
In which case, Francis, why don't the people who run these exchanges feel more of an obligation to include companies that are more representative of what the broader economy is actually doing?
Well, they may have the push towards doing that, especially because this representation has changed so dramatically. But let's also remember that the companies listed in, let's say, the S&P 500, they're really biased towards manufacturing sides of the economy, industrial and tech, whereas the things that affect your and my life on the day-to-day, things like services and jobs, are not represented there. So I'm not sure that we need to say we need to change the system. What we need to do is recognize that when someone says, buy a diversified portfolio, buy the S&P 500. Sure, it's more diversified than buying one stock, but 1/5 of what you own is big tech. So what we have to do first is really disabuse ourselves of the notion that when you buy an index, you're buying the broad economy. You certainly are not. Like I said, if you want to make a big bet on what you think the economy is going to do, zero in on why you think that's going to happen. Now, I will say on the flip side that if you had told me before, back in January, we're going to have a really bad pandemic and everyone's going to have to stay home and do their interviews with the agenda over their phone using high-end internet, they're going to have to work from home, buy their groceries online, what would I have invested in? I would have bought tech stock. It makes perfect sense. In the United States, I would have bought healthcare stocks, which are 15% of that index. Are we really saying that, sure, there's probably a divide between what these companies should be and what they shouldn't? But effectively, it makes a lot of sense to, I think, most people that tech companies and those that are affiliated with a pandemic and work from home are doing really well. And those like airlines and casinos are doing really poorly. When you put it in terms like that, does it really seem so disconnected?
No, that makes perfect sense the way you've just described it. But then, okay, well, Brian, why don't you help us by following up and track sort of the development of the tech stocks on the markets, how they have changed the composition of the exchanges over the last, let's say, 3 decades. What have you seen?
Well, it's much more recent than that. I mean, we saw the tech boom in the 90s, which collapsed. But in the 90s, the S&P was a much broader index. It had different sorts of companies in it, and these tech giants hadn't reached the level they have today. And we're talking now, 2 of them are trillion-dollar companies. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. But over the last decade, they've increasingly become more and more dominant. And once they entered the Dow Jones index, they began skewing that index as well in the same way. But if you leave them out, then you're leaving out the key drivers of the current market.
Okay, just out of curiosity, which of the $2 trillion companies? I think I can guess them, but I don't want to. I'm afraid to look very, very stupid right now. So maybe
right
you should
now,
just tell us.
Apple and Microsoft and Amazon sort of varies around there, but they're all pretty close.
Okay, good. All right, let's try this. How, if the tech companies, Francis, if they make up a disproportionately large share of the value in the market, but a sort of disproportionately smaller share of the number of employees in the market right now, what does that do to our understanding of the connection between the exchanges and the value of the economy?
Well, it should just reinforce that the stock market is not the economy, or put differently, that the stock market represents a share of the economy. And I'll give you one example. Now, in the S&P 500, we got about 50% of the market cap and earnings in the S&P 500 comes from the manufacturing sector. And yet manufacturing is only 10% of the US economy and less than 10% of jobs. Now, what's so critical about the current environment is the nature of the COVID-19 recession was such that it really hurt services. and it didn't hurt manufacturing to the same degree. So the part of the stock market that represents that manufacturing economy can do really well and deserves to do really well. Whereas what's really weighing on the economy is not as well represented in the stock market. So this disconnect, which historically didn't exist to the same extent because the recession would hurt all sectors, now is really being widened out by the nature of this recession here. One thing you might want to consider is if you're thinking about a sector, let's say you're really nervous about tech, maybe you want to move away from the US market, which is more tech-based, and move towards a Canadian or European market. They have much lower weights for the tech sector. So this is really encouraging a lot of conversations with my clients to think about, if you have a thesis, which index best represents it, because they vary internationally and they can even vary within a country.
Yeah, Brian, I want to understand that disconnect even further because, back in the day, an investor would take a look at a range of stocks and they would say, oh, that one there. Okay, that looks undervalued to me. They're not making a lot of profit now, but I think they could be in the future, so I'm going to bet on that one, invest in that one, and if it took off, great, you did well. Now there are companies, in fact, some of the most valued companies on the exchanges, not only don't make a profit, but have never made a profit. Tesla, for example, which is valued at many more times their profitability or what their assets reflect. Can you help us understand why that makes any sense?
Well, if you're talking about Tesla, it actually doesn't. Because what you're buying in Tesla is the promise that Elon Musk can create a company that has a moat built around it, to use Warren Buffett's famous phrase. In other words, the competition can't touch it. It's going to have a huge edge in the market. And because the market is going to go more and more toward electric vehicles, plus the other things that Elon Musk is involved in, well, that's great. Then you're getting a piece of that business. The problem is that other companies are entering that space. Some of them are just as good at car making as Tesla is, and some of them will copy Tesla. So therefore, where's the moat and where's the long-term value? There's a very famous hedge fund manager named David Einhorn, famous for his shorting, his bets that companies will go down. And he has a huge bet against Tesla, which for the last while has been looking pretty bad because Tesla stock has gone through the roof. But longer term, if you're as wealthy as he is and you can hang on long enough, then you'll probably be right.
So, Francis, should we think of the markets, rather than investing in companies that are profitable, as investing in companies that we figure someday might or should be profitable?
Well, a lot of that depends on your investment timeline. Are you willing to invest in a company and wait 5-10 years for that to materialize? Effectively, what we're discussing here is something that a lot of investors are challenged with, which is intangible assets. How do you value the part of the company that you can't specifically count? Sometimes we feel good about a company or we have hope for it. Just like maybe when you were a teenager, you liked someone who didn't have a job and lived in their parents' basement, but there was just something about them that you really felt like had potential. People feel that way about companies as well. And that's the part of it that becomes such a part of everyone's discussion is intangible elements of it. How do you value those? And they really come down to opinions along the way. So big bets on intangible parts of companies, that's really makes me nervous as an investor. I want to count things and be able to put things in a row and say, this is the real value of the company. But some people are willing to make those types of bets. You really have to have a long time horizon and a lot of risk appetite in order to do that.
Well, Brian, I've talked to sports fans who say, you know what, if you bet on the market, you're a sucker. No one understands the game. And I'd rather just, this person was telling me, said, I'd rather just bet on sports. I really know a lot about the NFL. It behaves and is predictable in a way that I better understand. And if I have to invest some money, why not invest in sports betting as opposed to the exchanges? What do you make of that reasoning?
Well, the fact is, you would have been doing much better if you had put your money in the markets, even during the worst of the downturn. Your returns would be a lot better and a lot safer than sports gambling. But that doesn't mean you're not gambling when you're in the marketplace. And if you're gambling on really speculative stocks, and Tesla, I think, is one of them, then you're making a bet. You're making a bet that the future is going to unfold the way Elon Musk tells you it will. And if it's right, then you do very well. You can even do well if you buy it at a reasonable price, watch it go up, and then get out. In sports betting, the odds are never in your favor in any kind of gambling, and I don't think the stock market's much different than that. The experts in the market always have an advantage over you and me. The insiders certainly have a much better advantage. That is the same in betting. And there are some people who say the market is more rigged than the sports betting scene. But the problem is that unless you have a long-term horizon, you are speculating. If you're a day trader, you're just like going to the casino. It's no different.
Francis, I should get you on the Tesla. Well, if you want, Francis, you can tell me who to bet on for the Super Bowl this year. But perhaps I should ask you what you think about the Tesla bet.
Oh, well, I'm a macro strategist, so my game is to think about longer term themes, then dive into which countries do best in them, and then go down into each individual stock. If you're asking me to make bets on the long-term shift in consumer behavior, I'd be more likely to say to you, you know what, governments are going to be spending a lot more money on green programs, and there's a lot of companies that will benefit from that. That might change the stock market and the composition of it. It may also change the bond market and the currency. So sometimes we need to push ourselves away from individual companies and ask ourselves, what is going on with the large thematic picture? That allows us to take a step back and properly assess whether this company is part of that longer term view. And, this is a really key messaging here, is that we've had this spectacular run up in the equity market that we're unlikely to see on an ongoing basis. We should not get used to that. What we have to do is think about ourselves on a 1 year, 3 year, and 5 year basis or longer, and allow our long-term investments to perform for us over that period. It means stay invested, don't get caught up in the everyday volatility, focus on your long-term investment goals.
Gotcha. Okay, you two get comfortable for a second, because this next question is going to require a bit of setup, and this is going to take a few seconds. The economy, of course, is now essentially global. There are massive amounts of wealth generated by a growing middle class in developing nations, and that means there is more money and more savings in the world that is looking for a place to generate some yield. And interest rates, as we know, have been very, very low for a very long time now. So those options aren't as preferable, or they aren't as interesting as, let's say, the stock market is today. Is that part of the reason why we're seeing the stock market rebounding so quickly? Brian, take this on first. Money, as they say, essentially, it just doesn't have as many places to go as it used to back in the day. Is that fair to say?
That's absolutely true. And in fact, there really is almost no place else for an investor to go without a high cost. The bond market is in a situation today where the safest bonds cost you money to buy them. If you try to buy most bonds issued by governments like Germany or Switzerland, and even U.S. bonds, if you look at real rates, you're paying those governments for the privilege of owning their bonds, which is sort of silly. You can still buy corporate bonds, and if you get really good corporate bonds, they're very safe, but the interest rates are so low that equities become the only game in town. And the fact is that that's not just because of the pandemic. That's been true for a while.
Francis, your view on that?
Absolutely could not agree more. Let me give you the perspective of, a large pension fund, for example. Now, a lot of the time we're talking about how you or I might decide to trade stocks at the end of the day or build our personal portfolios, but a lot of what happens in markets is driven by these large institutional managers, pension funds, and the like. Now, what happens is pension funds have to generate 6-7% return a year after fees, for example, after they account for inflation. They have to be able to make sure that they're paying their pensioners a certain amount. Here's the big problem. When interest rates are at or below zero and 25% of global government bonds are giving you negative yield, so as we just spoke about, giving you less money back, if you need to generate that amount, that's your hurdle rate, you're going to have to go into other asset classes. You have no choice. That's the really big problem here. You have to put money to work and you have to generate a certain amount of yield. So you are going to see people who go out for further and further risk. That generally means equities, but it doesn't just mean equities. It means that we're probably going to see appetite for new asset classes that maybe we're a little bit fringe before. I think this is one of the reasons things like Bitcoin get a lot of attention. But there's all the other areas like infrastructure funds or even investing in emerging markets. These are things that everyday Canadians maybe are not considering on the day-to-day that they're going to have to start thinking about. Hard assets, real estate is another area to go, even things like gold. So the traditional, buy some stocks, buy some bonds, that's not going to work in this extremely low interest rate environment, particularly with interest rates that are this low and likely to be low for a very long time.
Well, Brian, pick up on that, because I don't know that we've seen double-digit interest rates in 3 decades or so. Can you imagine how long it will take to get back to that?
It could be years and years. I mean, they're already talking about keeping interest rates rock bottom in key developed markets like the US, Europe, and Canada. Japan, which has had 0 rates for years. And that really cuts down the markets you can venture into, even in terms of buying stocks. Yes, you can get into infrastructure funds. You can buy, farmland in northern Saskatchewan, but there are high risks associated with that. And one of the risks is how do you get rid of those things when you need to sell? The equity markets have a lot of capital. They're fluid. You can buy and sell pretty easily. They're flexible. And if you make the right decisions, you can at least approach the kind of returns you need to keep your investors happy.
So, Brian, are we in a bubble or no?
Are we in a bubble? It depends what part of the market you're talking about. If you're talking about the Exxons of the world, there's no bubble. If you're talking about commercial real estate, if you're talking about transportation, there's no bubble in those sectors. There is a bubble in tech. It's not quite as crazy as the late 1990s when people were buying companies not only that had no profit, but they had no revenue. That's not the case today. The leading companies are profitable. They are producing big revenues, but they're not producing them at a level that would say this investment at these prices makes sense. They are overbought, and that tends to be one of the definitions of a bubble, and all bubbles burst eventually, including this one.
What's your view on that, Francis?
Oh, here's the challenge is you can call for a bubble, but when does it burst? And my sense, probably only when we start to see interest rates start to rise. And in my forecast, I don't have any central bank raising interest rates for at least 5 years. And if I had a longer investment horizon, I'd probably extend it years out to that. So we are going to see volatility. You're more likely to see larger pullbacks occurring in the tech stocks. But I think the game here is not just to call the bubble, but really get a sense of timing the market, which is something that very few of us should be trying to do. It's extremely difficult. As I said earlier in the show, we want to focus on our longer term investment themes, good entering opportunities on pullbacks, and really focus on where do you think these markets are going to be over the next 3 to 5 years? Because timing a bubble, it's really tough.
Okay, in our last couple of minutes here, I want to get a sense from each of you. To the best of my knowledge, investors like stability. Markets like stability. They don't like wars around the world. They don't like surprises. They like stability. In which case, let me sort of put both of you on the spot here. Would a Trump re-election in November be stabilizing and therefore good for the markets? Or would more of this, let's just use a nice neutral term like disruptive behavior, be injurious to the markets? Brian, what do you say?
Well, the fact is that there used to be a view that a Republican president was always better for the markets because they were business friendly, they got rid of regulations, they made life easier on the tax side. And Trump did that early in his presidency. He cut taxes. He took away some onerous regulations, at least onerous from the point of view of the Wall Street investment banks. They were happy with that. But I'd say if you look at the recent market performance, they're basically saying, well, we don't really care about Trump, and we don't care about Biden either, because we don't think Biden's going to be a threat. If it had been a more progressive activist type candidate for the Democrats, like Elizabeth Warren, who was not well liked on Wall Street, then I think you might have seen an adverse market reaction. Biden doesn't scare them. Trump may scare them, but they've learned to live with him over the last few years, and they've learned to live with the volatility. But overall, Trump will have a much more negative effect on the markets going forward, especially if he continues his trade battles with China and his pullback from international obligations. That's a big risk.
Francis, last word to you.
It's not that markets like stability, it's that they like predictability. They like to know what's going to happen next. And in that sense, Trump is a little bit devil you know. Yeah, maybe some things come out that we weren't expecting on a certain day, but we generally know his modus operandi. We know how he feels about China. We know how he feels about a variety of different functions. But the truth is, when I walk into work every day, I'm not checking the polls on whether Biden or Trump win. I'm checking the polls on the Senate. Because what really matters to markets is not necessarily who wins the presidency, it's the composition of the government. If Trump wins re-election, for example, but he loses the Senate, then he won't have the ability to pass bills. The same is true for Biden. So generally, markets actually like that mixed government. It means that you don't get any extreme policies through, you get middle of the road policies through. But we probably need to switch our focus away from who wins the presidency and its impact on markets to what does the total government look like. That could actually create some waves one way or another, depending on this. So focus on the Senate in conjunction with the presidency race would be my number one advice on this topic.
The more deadlocked they are in Washington, the happier Wall Street is.
Okay, understood. Francis Donald, Brian Milner, that was just terrific. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us on TVO tonight, and thank you for sharing your views. And that is the agenda for Tuesday, September 15th, 2020. 25 years ago this month, a clash between the province of Ontario and Indigenous protesters at the Ipperwash Provincial Park left one person dead and a legacy for all of us to reflect on. We'll do some of that tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.